This lesson will cover big concepts from Unit 3, looking at chapters 4, 5, and 6 on cultural patterns. First, we can look at the difference between folk and pop culture. Folk culture is identified by a low level of technology, local materials, it is transmitted interpersonally, it includes stable, conservative, and traditionalist values. It's based on an idea of community and shared experience and mutual obligations. It's got clear-cut social roles, specifically for males and females, and a division of labor. It's also adapted to a particular environment. So again, folk culture may also be spread by word of mouth as opposed to having a literary history. Looking at popular culture, we see that it's mass produced. There's a high level of technology. It's a global environment. It's transmitted by media like books or television and the internet. It's constantly changing and innovating. It's based on the idea of society with specialized roles and interdependence and impersonal coordination. It's flexible and vague when it comes to social roles. They're not uh, they're not absolute, and then they're also not adapted to any particular environment. We can also compare folk and pop culture in a number of different topics or areas, categories. Societally speaking, folk culture is rural and more isolated. It's homogenous and indigenous. Most people speak in an indigenous or ethnic local language. For pop culture, it's urban and connected to location, a diverse and multi-ethnic for the population. Many people speak a global language like a lingua franca, maybe English or Arabic. For social structure, for folk culture, there's an emphasis on community and conformity. Families live close to each other, and it's well-defined gender roles that you'll see. For pop culture, there's an emphasis on individualism and making choices, dispersed families, and weakly defined gender roles. For diffusion, under folk culture, it's relatively slow and limited, primarily through relocation, and you've got more oral tradition passed down. In pop culture, it's relatively rapid and extensive. It's often hierarchical, and it can be passed down through social media and mass media. Looking at buildings and houses for folk culture, materials are produced locally, like stone or grass. It's built by communities or the owners. You also have similar styles for the community, and it might be different between the cultures that are present. And then for pop culture, materials are produced in distant factories like steel or glass. It's built by businesses. You've got a variety of different architectural styles, and it might be similar between cities. For food, food in folk culture is locally produced. Choices are limited by tradition, and it's usually prepared by family or the community. For pop culture, it's often imported. There's a wide range of choice, and it could be purchased in restaurants as well. So for spatial focus, you've got local and regional when talking about folk culture, and then national or global when talking about pop culture. Culture can also be reflected in language, and so these are the most spoken languages in the world. They include English, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Punjabi, Hindi, Chinese or Mandarin, Bengali, Russian, and Japanese. This can take us to the structure of language family trees, where we see that there is a correlation or relationship that some languages have to each other, in which they may sound quite similar, and there may not be a surprise, especially if they belong to the same family or the same branch. So for example, when we're looking at the image here, we see prehistoric stumps below ground. We really don't see the families come up until we see actual growth of the trees here. So the largest would include the Sino-Tibetan and the Indo-European families. And then within those families, we see branches, which would include Indo-Iranian, Romance, West Germanic. And then we can come over here and we can see Austro-Thai as an example of different branches that can exist here too. And then we see Mandarin is the largest language that stems from. This is a leaf, but then the actual group of leaves would be considered a language group. you would see a lot of similarities there. So Mandarin and Cantonese would be examples that would stem from that family. And then if you come over to Romance, we can see Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian. This is a group. Each of the leaves represents a language, part of the Romance branch, which is also part of the Indo-European family. This is a map of China where you can see it is actually quite diverse. Even though Mandarin is the primary language that is spoken among a larger population, it is by no means the only language that is represented or spoken. We see many different languages, the two largest being Cantonese and Mandarin, of course. Unesco, which is an organization under the United Nations, helps to preserve or identify, I should say, World Heritage Sites. And these are considered significant or important because they're reflective of culture. So if we were to go over to this link here, we can actually see some of the major UNESCO sites. And so this might include Machu Picchu, which is in Peru. We can also see the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. We can see Bagan in Myanmar. And then we can also see Angkor Wat in Cambodia. We see the Great Wall of China, the Colosseum in Italy. And again, all of these different structures, which have been human built, are a reflection of culture, both historically and currently, right? There is some relevance that, and some connection we can make there. Religion is also a focus of the Cultural Geography unit, although it's not heavily tested. There are some things about religion you want to be familiar with, mainly the number of adherents, different regions of the world that it's most commonly practiced. Those are some things you want to know. In addition to that, some of these religions may not technically be considered religions, although they do still fit into that chapter because we can look to adherents, certain rituals, traditions, practices that would be best classified that way. And so we have the big ones: Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Confucianism. We see numbers that correspond to the population of adherents, which is why they would be considered relevant. They have a large, in large part, they dictate culture. And then you also see name of deity here, which ones are, again, more philosophies, don't really follow this notion that there is a God, more spiritual. And so, yeah. And then the founder would be also listed here as well. Holy books, there might be some correlation. For example, much of the scripture within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are very similar as they share much of those stories. And then for leadership, you also have the way that the leadership within those religions would be referred to. So, for example, with Buddhism, we see monks. For Christianity, you might see priests and ministers, nuns. When we're looking at Hinduism, we see Brahmin priests, monks, and gurus. For Islam, we don't see a clergy, but we may see an imam, for example. And then for Judaism, we have rabbis. So just some examples. And then there are also basic beliefs here as well, but you can take some time to review that on your own. All right, and then of course we want to know where each of these religions are most commonly practiced in different parts of the world. We see that Christianity is the largest. However, the fastest growing religion happens to be Islam, so keep that in mind, much more prevalent in the Middle East. We do see that there are also regions of the world that are considered non-religious, China being a country in which is reflected by a non-religious affiliation. Not to say there aren't religious people there, because churches or religious affiliations are registered there. It's not as if it's illegal, but they do have to be registered with the government to be able to operate. And then you also see like Judaism, which isn't very reflected here, but we do see it in Israel here. And then we also see Hinduism, which is, reflected here in South Asia, particularly within India. So religion is not a heavily tested subject for FRQs, but there have been a few. So take a look at this question here with reference to each of the following. Explain how religion has shaped the cultural landscape and support each explanation with one example. So in this case, we're looking at sacred sites. We know that sacred sites exist. They are part of the cultural landscape, and religion is impacting that. So you can kind of talk freely about what you know about each of these topics. You might find that it's a lot easier than you think. So for sacred sites, one would want to talk about the ongoing preservation of space, the visitation of holy sites or pilgrimages by adherents, the visitation of holy sites or pilgrimages by non-adherents. So again, this could also encourage tourism, people wanting to go to a place that's very distinctive and culturally different, and the development of local norms of behavior, tension or conflict over the use of sacred sites. These are all things that you could talk about, and these are also examples of different sacred sites that you could use as examples. And then for burial sites and practices, we see an imposition on the conformity of a landscape affects the local land use and then makes the landscape distinctive. We can also see like the difference between cremation and burials and how that could be connected to different religions as well. Whereas cremation is common within Hinduism, or is the practice within Hinduism and Buddhism. We also see that burial is the practice that is common with, or that is seen with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Okay, and then architecture could also be one way that the cultural landscape can be impacted and related to religion, making the landscape distinctive and representing religious history, restricting or encouraging the use of land and the surrounding area and attracting tourists. And then lastly, I'm looking at place names, being able to promote a regional distinctiveness, and then confirming the importance of religion in everyday life. So just some examples here. You can see it was probably much simpler to answer that question than you may have thought. Here's another question too, looking at church affiliation in the United States, looking at different religions and what types of religions are more prominent in different parts of the country. That in this case, we're talking the U.S. So we've got a darker region here in the key. We see that is group X, religious group Y is up here, and then religious group Z would be right here. And so the map above shows the distribution of 3 religious groups in the contiguous U.S. Using the letters in the legend, name the 3 religious groups shown on the map. For one of the 3 religious groups, first identify and then explain 2 factors that have influenced the distribution shown on the map. And then lastly, explain how the map, as presented at this scale, is an incomplete representation of the geography of religion in the U.S. So what religions are absent from this map, but definitely exist and maybe should be reflected on? So for each of these religions, we have region X, which was Mormonism. That was kind of in the Utah area. Region Y, which is what we see in, that's Lutheran, sorry. So Lutheran. And so that's region Y. That's kind of more the Midwest, kind of northern Midwest. And so, we can see that the connection is related to Germans and Scandinavians, which migrated from Europe in large numbers, bringing with them their religion. And then for region Z, we see that this has more to do with Baptists or Southern Baptists. And so we see that this is more present in smaller towns and rural areas in the southeastern region of the U.S. And so the Baptist religion matured as an indigenous religion in the rural South based on Calvinism, which was brought from Europe. And so, with that being said, because we're running out of time, if you wanted to go ahead and look at these FRQs, you can access them on College Board. But as I mentioned before, religion is not a heavily tested topic because it is sensitive, and many of these FRQs that you do see or that we discussed with regard to religion are also fairly old.